Thunder roared over the Winthrop estate, shaking the glass walls as chaos erupted in the West Wing. 10-year-old Jake Winthrop lay still on the polished floor, his face pale, his small chest barely rising. Naomi Brooks, the young black maid, knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she clutched something small, black, and glistening. Arthur Winthrop, the billionaire who believed his wealth could bend the world to his will, stormed into the room, his voice sharp with fury. "What have you done to my son?" Naomi's eyes glistened with tears. "Sir, I swear, I was only trying to help." Arthur's hand shot toward his phone to call security, but a faint, trembling voice stopped him cold. "Dad." The room fell silent. Jake, the boy who had never heard a sound in his 10 years of life, had spoken. Arthur staggered back, his eyes locked on his son. The maid he had dismissed as invisible had just shattered the silence that all his millions could not break. Dear viewers, this is a story of courage, love, and a miracle born from the heart of someone the world overlooked. Stay with me, because what unfolds next will remind you that sometimes the answers we seek come from the places and people we least expect. My beautiful family, let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now let us begin. The Winthrop Mansion was a monument to wealth, its marble halls gleaming under crystal chandeliers. Yet beneath its polished surface, it held a heavy silence. Arthur Winthrop, a man whose name adorned skyscrapers and magazine covers, ruled his empire with precision. But no amount of money could fill the void in his home. His only son, Jake, was born deaf, a truth no doctor could change. Arthur had poured millions into experimental treatments, flying in specialists from across the globe, but each effort ended in the same empty quiet. Jake, with his wide blue eyes, lived in a world without sound, watching the world move as if it whispered secrets he could never hear. The staff tiptoed around him, some with pity, others with unease, as if his silence was a curse. But then came Naomi Brooks. At 27, Naomi was a single mother from South Carolina, hired as a maid to keep the mansion spotless. She carried herself with quiet strength, her hands worn from work, her heart heavy with memories of her brother Marcus, who died from an untreated ear infection in their impoverished hometown. That loss had etched a promise into her soul. She would never turn away from a child in need. The first time Naomi saw Jake, he was sketching alone in the vast library, his small hands tracing lines of imaginary worlds. He didn't look up, but Naomi noticed the loneliness in his careful movements. From that day, she began leaving small gifts, a folded paper star, a sketch of a bird, a smile through a few clumsy signs. At first, Jake ignored them. But one morning, Naomi found her paper star tucked carefully among Jake's pencils, a silent reply. And so, a bond began to grow, a bond that would soon unravel a mystery no one else had dared to see. The Winthrop Mansion stood like a glass cathedral, its towering windows catching the morning light in a dazzle of wealth. Inside, every surface gleamed, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, sleek furniture that cost more than most people's homes. Yet the air was heavy, as if the house itself held its breath. Arthur Winthrop, a 48-year-old tech billionaire, had built an empire that spanned continents. His name was synonymous with innovation, his face a fixture on magazine covers. But behind the polished exterior, a wound festered, one his billions could not heal. Jake's mother, Emily, had died 6 years earlier in a car accident, leaving a void that echoed louder than the mansion's silence. Arthur and Jake were tethered by love, but separated by a canyon of loneliness. Arthur buried himself in work, commanding boardrooms while Jake sat alone, sketching imaginary worlds in the vast library. The staff, trained to be invisible, moved like ghosts, their pity for the boy mingling with unease. Some whispered that his silence was a curse, a mark of the family's hubris. Then came Naomi Brooks. Naomi worked quietly, her presence barely noticed by the mansion's staff. She polished banisters, dusted chandeliers, and kept her head down. But when she saw Jake, something stirred. He wasn't a diagnosis or a tragedy to her. He was a boy, small and curious, with a spark in his eyes that others overlooked. Unlike the staff, who signed to him with mechanical precision, Naomi learned sign language with purpose. She watched online videos late at night, practicing until her fingers ached. She wanted Jake to know he was seen. One afternoon, while cleaning the library, Naomi found Jake hunched over a sketch of a dragon, his pencil moving with fierce concentration. She hesitated, then slid a napkin across the table, a silly face drawn in marker, a bug-eyed monster with a lopsided grin. Jake glanced up, his lips twitching. He grabbed the napkin, added a spiky tail to her monster, and pushed it back. Naomi laughed, signing "Funny Dragon." Jake's eyes lit up, and for a moment the room felt alive. From then on, Naomi left small gifts: a folded paper bird, a pebble painted with a smile, a note with a doodle of the moon. Jake began to wait for them, his sketches growing brighter, his shoulders less hunched. When Naomi signed to him, her hands moved with warmth, not duty. She told him stories through gestures, tales of stars that danced and trees that whispered. Jake watched, rapt, his fingers mimicking hers as he learned new signs. One evening, as Naomi swept the hallway, she heard a soft tap. Jake stood behind her, holding a drawing, a stick figure Naomi with a halo of stars. He signed "Thank you," his small hands careful but sure. Naomi's throat tightened. She knelt, signing back, "You're welcome, little star." Jake's face broke into a grin, wide and unguarded. For the first time in years, laughter, silent but real, drifted through the halls of the Winthrop mansion. But the warmth of that moment faded as the days grew heavier. One gray afternoon, while Naomi dusted Jake's collection of toy planes in the library, she noticed him flinch. The 10-year-old sat cross-legged on the rug, his sketchbook open, but his pencil lay still. He pressed a small hand against his right ear, his face twisting in a grimace that sent a chill through her. Naomi set down her cloth and knelt beside him, her fingers moving quickly. "Pain," she signed, her eyes searching his. Jake nodded, his blue eyes clouded with discomfort. He pressed harder against his ear, his lips tightening. Naomi's heart quickened. She straightened and hurried down the marble corridor to the nurse's station, where Ms. Carter, the head nurse, sat flipping through a chart. "Ms. Carter," Naomi said, her voice steady but urgent. "Jake's in pain. He's holding his ear. I think something's wrong." The nurse barely looked up. "He's fine. Probably just pressure from the weather." Don't interfere, Maid. Her tone was sharp, slicing through Naomi's concern like a blade. Your job is to clean, not play doctor. Naomi stood frozen, the dismissal stinging. But as she turned away, a memory clawed its way to the surface. Her brother Marcus, 9 years old, clutching his head in their cramped South Carolina apartment. His silent tears, his fevered skin, the way he'd looked at her as if she could fix it. No doctor had listened then, and Marcus's ear infection had spread until it stole his life. Naomi's chest tightened. She wouldn't let that happen again. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in her small staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, the mansion's silence pressing against her like a weight. Marcus's face haunted her, his pleading eyes, his soundless cries. By midnight, she couldn't stay still. Something inside her whispered, "Go to him." Naomi slipped through the darkened halls, her sneakers soft against the marble. Jake's room was dimly lit by a nightlight, casting shadows of toy planes across the walls. She found him curled on his bed, sweating, his hands clutching his head. His eyes fluttered open, wide and fearful, as she knelt beside him. "It's okay, little star," she signed, her hands trembling. "I'm here." Jake's fingers fumbled a reply. "Hurts." Naomi's breath caught. She grabbed a flashlight from her pocket, her heart pounding as she tilted his head gently. "Hold still, baby," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. She leaned closer, shining the light into his ear. Her pulse roared in her ears as she saw it, something tiny, black, and twitching, lodged deep inside. Her hands shook, the flashlight nearly slipping. It was alive, whatever it was, nestled against the delicate curve of his ear canal. Her mind raced back to Marcus, to the infection no one had caught in time. This was different, strange, unnatural, but it was real, and it was hurting Jake. Naomi's first instinct was to run for help, to wake the nurse or call a doctor. But Ms. Carter's cold words echoed in her mind. "Don't interfere, Maid." She thought of Arthur Winthrop, his towering presence, his distrust of anyone who stepped out of place. If she was wrong, she'd lose everything. Her job, her daughter's future, maybe even her freedom. But if she was right, love was louder than fear. Naomi whispered a prayer, her voice barely audible in the silent room. "God, please, show me what to do." She glanced at Jake, his small face twisted in pain, trusting her. She couldn't turn away. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around a pair of tweezers she'd used to fix a broken toy earlier that day. Her hands trembled as she sterilized them with a wipe from her kit, her breath shallow. She signed to Jake, "Stay still." "I'll help." His eyes locked on hers, wide but steady, as if he believed she could make the pain stop. Naomi took a deep breath, reached for the tweezers, and prayed that God would guide her hand. She leaned close to Jake, the flashlight's beam trembling as she angled it into his ear. The tiny, black thing twitched faintly, lodged deep against the delicate curve of his ear canal. Jake whimpered, his small body tensing with pain, but his eyes stayed fixed on hers, trusting. Naomi's heart pounded, her fingers steadying the tweezers as she whispered, "It's okay, little star. Just hold still." Her hand moved with agonizing care, inching toward the object. The metal grazed it, and Jake flinched, a soft cry escaping his lips. Naomi froze, her breath catching. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. She adjusted her grip, her pulse roaring in her ears, and footsteps thundered down the hall. The door to Jake's room flew open, and Arthur Winthrop stood in the frame, his face pale with rage. "What are you doing to my son?" His voice was a blade, cutting through the quiet. Naomi's hand jerked back, the tweezers slipping from her fingers. They clattered to the floor as she stammered, "Sir, I think there's something." "Get away from him." Arthur barked, his eyes blazing. He stormed forward, towering over her. "You dare touch my son?" Naomi's hands trembled, the flashlight falling to her side. "Please, Mr. Winthrop, he's hurting. There's something alive in his ear." Her voice cracked, desperate, but Arthur's face was a mask of fury, unyielding. "Guards! Now!" he roared. Heavy boots echoed as two security guards burst into the room, their faces stern. Naomi stumbled back as they grabbed her arms, their grip bruising. "No, please," she cried, twisting to look at Jake. "He's in pain. I was trying to help." Jake's face crumpled, his small hands reaching for her as he cried soundlessly, his silent sobs shaking his frail frame. Arthur ignored Naomi's pleas, dropping to his knees beside his son. "Jake, I'm here," he said, his voice tight with fear, though Jake couldn't hear it. He cradled the boy's head, his hands shaking as he checked for injury. "Call the doctor," Arthur ordered the nurse who had rushed in behind the guards. "And throw her out." His words were cold, final, as if Naomi were nothing more than a stain to be scrubbed from his pristine world. The guards pulled Naomi toward the door, her sneakers squeaking against the marble. She twisted in their grip, her heart breaking as she looked back at Jake. "Please, Mr. Winthrop, listen to me," she begged. "There's something in his ear. I saw it." Arthur didn't turn, his focus locked on his son. The nurse hovered nearby, her lips pursed, her eyes flicking to Naomi with disdain. "You're lucky he's not hurt worse," she muttered, as if Naomi's very presence were a crime. The class and racial divide in the room was palpable. Naomi, the young black maid from a world of struggle, stood no chance against the billionaire's world of power. Her word, her care, her desperate act of courage meant nothing in the face of Arthur's pride. He was a man who had built his empire on control, and the idea that a maid could see what his doctors had missed was unthinkable. As the guards dragged her down the corridor, Naomi's tears burned hot. She craned her neck, catching one last glimpse of Jake's room. Her breath caught as she saw it, a single droplet of blood rolling from Jake's ear, staining the pale marble. Then, something small, black, and glistening fell to the floor, wriggling faintly in the dim light. Naomi's heart lurched. She tried to shout to warn them, but the guards tightened their hold, pulling her farther down the hall. The nurse gasped, bending to look at the object, but Arthur's focus remained on Jake, oblivious to the discovery. The door to the west wing swung shut, cutting off Naomi's view. She stumbled, her knees weak, as the guards marched her toward the mansion's entrance. Her mind raced with images of Marcus, his silent pain, his unanswered cries. She'd promised herself she'd never let another child suffer like that, but now she was powerless, cast out for daring to care. The last thing Naomi saw before the door closed was Jake reaching for her, tears spilling from his silent eyes. Minutes later, a scream pierced the silence of the Winthrop mansion, sharp and raw, echoing through the marble halls. Naomi, still restrained by the guards at the end of the corridor, froze, her heart lurching. The sound came from Jake's room, a cry of shock rather than pain. Her breath caught, fear and hope tangling in her chest. Inside the west wing, Arthur ran back to Jake's room, his polished shoes slipping on the marble. He burst through the door to find his son sitting up on the bed, dazed, his blue eyes wide and searching. The doctor on call, summoned in the chaos, stood frozen, his stethoscope dangling uselessly from his hand. "Ms. Carter," the head nurse, hovered near the bed, her face pale, her hands clutching the chart as if it could anchor her to reality. Jake's lips trembled, his small chest heaving. Then a sound, fragile, impossible, broke the silence. "Dad!" Arthur stopped dead, his breath hitching. The word hung in the air, a single syllable that shattered a decade of quiet. Jake's eyes locked on his father's, and he spoke again, louder this time. "Dad!" Tears streamed down Arthur's face, carving paths through his composed exterior. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his hands reaching for Jake's. "Say it again," he whispered, his voice raw, pleading. "Please, Jake, say it again." "Dad," Jake said, his voice stronger, clearer, as if testing the sound of his own existence. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with wonder. The doctor shook himself from his stupor and leaned closer, his hands trembling as he examined Jake's ear. His gaze darted to the floor, where the small black object lay, a glistening, hardened lava cocoon, no bigger than a grain of rice, wriggling faintly in the dim light. Naomi, still pinned by the guard's iron grips at the end of the hall, heard Jake's voice carry through the open door. Her knees buckled, and she sobbed, her tears falling freely. "I told you," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I told you something was there." The doctor picked up the cocoon with gloved fingers, holding it to the light. His face was a mask of disbelief. This was blocking the ear canal," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "A parasite, lodged against the eardrum. It must have caused nerve compression." He looked up at Arthur, his eyes wide. All the scans, the tests, the surgeries, they missed it. The boy was never truly deaf. His hearing was blocked. Arthur's head snapped up, his gaze shifting from Jake to the doctor, then to the cocoon. The weight of the words crashed over him. 10 years of specialists, millions spent on futile treatments, and a maid, a woman he'd dismissed as insignificant, had seen what no one else had. His son, his silent boy, had been unheard, trapped behind a barrier no one thought to look for. Jake reached out, his small hand touching Arthur's cheek, wiping away a tear. "Dad," he said again, softer now, as if marveling at the sound. Arthur pulled him close, his shoulders shaking, the canyon of loneliness between them beginning to close. The nurse stood frozen, her earlier disdain replaced by stunned silence. The room hummed with awe, the impossible made real in a single, trembling moment. Naomi's sobs echoed faintly from the corridor, her voice a mix of relief and heartbreak. "I told you," she whispered again, her words muffled by the guard's hold. One of them loosened his grip, uncertainty flickering in his eyes as Jake's voice reached them. The other guard hesitated, glancing toward the room where the miracle unfolded. Arthur stood slowly, his eyes still fixed on Jake, who was now signing to himself, testing the bridge between his silent world and this new one filled with sound. The billionaire's face was a storm of emotions, disbelief, gratitude, guilt. He turned toward the door, where Naomi stood restrained, her apron stained with tears, her hands still trembling from the weight of what she'd done. The doctor shook his head, muttering, "This shouldn't have been possible." But it was. And it was Naomi who had made it so. Arthur looked at the maid he'd condemned, and saw not a servant, but a savior. He should have been grateful, his heart swelling with relief as Jake's voice, small, miraculous, echoed in his mind. But pride, that old unyielding wall, battled with the shame now creeping through him. Arthur Winthrop, the man who commanded empires, stood frozen in Jake's room, the air thick with wonder and tension. The doctor still clutched the lava cocoon, muttering about nerve compression, while Jake clung to his father's hand, his eyes darting toward Naomi, who remained restrained at the corridor's end. Miss Carter, the head nurse, stepped forward, her voice low and venomous. "She violated protocol, Mr. Winthrop. She's dangerous. A maid playing doctor could have killed him." Her words were sharp, slicing through the ore, stoking the embers of Arthur's distrust. Naomi's act, however miraculous, had defied his carefully controlled world. His instinct, honed by years of power, was to reassert order. "Take her away," Arthur said, his voice tight, almost mechanical, "until I decide what to do." He avoided Naomi's eyes, his gaze fixed on Jake, who was now signing rapidly, his small hands trembling with agitation. Naomi's sob broke the silence, a sound of heartbreak and disbelief. "Mr. Winthrop, please," she whispered, but the guards tightened their grip, pulling her farther down the hall. Jake's head snapped up, his face twisting in panic. He tore free from Arthur's hand and ran toward Naomi, his voice, new, raw, and piercing, cutting through the mansion like a blade. "No!" Jake screamed, his first real scream in 10 years, a sound that vibrated with desperation. He wrapped his small arms around Naomi's legs, clinging to her as if she were his lifeline. The guards hesitated, their hands loosening as Jake's cry echoed, raw and unfiltered. Naomi's tears fell onto his hair, her bound hands unable to reach him. The sound shattered Arthur's arrogance like glass. He staggered back, his chest tightening as he watched his son, his silent, unreachable son, fight for the woman he'd ordered away. Jake's voice, so long absent, was a hammer against the walls Arthur had built around his heart. The room fell silent, the nurse's accusations fading, the doctor's mutterings irrelevant. All that remained was Jake's trembling form and Naomi's quiet sobs. Arthur waved the guards back, his voice hoarse. "Let her go." They released Naomi, and she dropped to her knees, pulling Jake into her arms. He buried his face in her shoulder, his small body shaking. Arthur watched, a stranger in his own home, as the maid who had given him back his son became the one Jake turned to for comfort. That night, Arthur sat alone in his study, the mansion's silence heavier than ever. The crystal decanter on his desk remained untouched, its amber contents glinting under the lamplight. Instead, he opened the security system on his laptop, pulling up the footage from Jake's room. He rewatched it, frame by frame, unable to look away. There was Naomi, slipping into the room after midnight, her flashlight trembling as she knelt beside Jake. Her lips moved in a whispered prayer, her hands steady despite their shake as she reached for the tweezers. Her courage, her care, it was all there, captured in grainy light. Arthur's throat tightened. He saw the moment she gasped, spotting the thing in Jake's ear. He saw her hesitation, the fear in her eyes, and then the resolve that pushed her forward. She hadn't acted for glory or gain. She'd acted for Jake. For love. He thought of the years he'd spent chasing solutions, throwing money at doctors who offered nothing but jargon. He thought of the nights he'd sat in this very study, staring at Jake's baby photos, willing the world to give him back his son's voice. And all along, the answer had been in the hands of a woman he'd barely acknowledged. A maid, a single mother, a black woman from a world he'd never bothered to understand. Tears fell unbidden as Arthur's pride crumbled. For the first time in years, the billionaire who thought he could buy anything fell to his knees and wept. Not for Jake's voice, but for his own blindness. At dawn, the man who had fired her was on his way to Harlem, not as a boss, but as a beggar of forgiveness. Naomi's small apartment in Harlem smelled of coffee and cardboard, the air heavy with the weight of her decision to leave. She folded her daughter's clothes into a worn suitcase, her hands moving mechanically, her heart still raw from the previous night. The memory of Jake's scream, his small arms clinging to her, looped in her mind. She'd failed to protect her brother Marcus all those years ago, but she'd fought for Jake, and lost everything for it. The city loomed outside her window, vast and unforgiving, ready to swallow her again. A knock at the door startled her. Naomi hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron, and opened it to find Arthur Winthrop standing on her stoop. The billionaire was drenched from the early morning rain, his tailored coat clinging to his frame, his eyes red and hollow. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, stripped of the commanding presence that had filled the mansion. "Naomi," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't deserve forgiveness, but my son does. Please come back." Naomi's breath caught, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to shut the door, to shield herself from the man who'd cast her out without a second thought. "You think money fixes everything?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "You think you can just show up and make this right?" Arthur shook his head, rain dripping from his hair. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "Money can't fix this. But maybe gratitude can start something new." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Jake needs you. I saw the footage, your courage, your care. I was wrong, Naomi. I was blind." Naomi's throat tightened, memories of Jake's small hand in hers, his paper stars, his trust flooding back. She thought of Marcus, of the promise she'd made to never turn away from a child in need. Arthur's words hung between them, raw and unpolished, a crack in the armor of a man who had never begged before. He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded paper, not a contract, but a letter. "I'm not offering you your old job," he said. "I'm asking you to be Jake's caretaker, his companion. Not as a maid, but as family. Please for him." Naomi stared at the letter, her heart warring with itself. She wanted to refuse, to hold on to the pain of his betrayal. But Jake's face, his wide eyes, his fragile voice, rose in her mind. "For Jake," she said finally, her voice steady but soft. "Not for you." Arthur nodded, relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he whispered. By midday, Naomi was back at the Winthrop mansion, her daughter's hand in hers as they crossed the marble threshold. The staff watched in stunned silence, their whispers trailing off as Naomi walked past, no longer in her maid's uniform, but in a simple dress, her head held high. The air felt different, lighter, as if the house itself sensed a shift. Jake was in the library, sketching at his desk, when he heard the door creak. His head snapped up, and his eyes lit with recognition. "Miss Naomi," he whispered, his voice still new, still a miracle. He ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist, his small body trembling with joy. Naomi knelt, pulling him close, her tears falling into his hair. "I'm here, little star," she signed, her hand steady now. Jake giggled, a sound so pure it seemed to dance through the room. Naomi laughed too, the warmth of it spreading like sunlight. The staff, lingering in the doorway, exchanged glances, their pity for the silent boy replaced by awe. Arthur stood at the edge of the room, watching, his eyes glistening. For the first time, he didn't try to control the moment, he simply let it be. Naomi took Jake's hand, leading him to the piano in the corner. She tapped a key, letting the note hum through the air. Jake's eyes widened, his fingers brushing the keys as if discovering a new world. He pressed one, then another, a clumsy melody filling the space. Naomi clapped, signing beautiful. Jake grinned, his laughter joining the notes. For the first time, the mansion of silence learned to sing. Months later, the Winthrop mansion was no longer a monument to quiet despair. Its marble halls hummed with life, filled with the sound of Jake's voice, clear, bright, and growing stronger every day. At 10 years old, the boy who had once lived in a world without sound now spoke with confidence, his words tumbling out in excited bursts. He painted vibrant pictures of dragons and stars, his sketchbook overflowing with color, and sang songs Naomi taught him, his voice carrying melodies of hope through the library. Naomi, now his full-time caretaker, sat with him daily, guiding his speech with patience and warmth, her laughter mingling with his as they practiced new words. The change in Jake was a miracle, but it was only the beginning. Arthur Winthrop, once a man who believed money could solve all problems, had been reshaped by the events of that stormy night. His pride had crumbled, replaced by a quiet humility that surprised even himself. He spent hours with Jake, listening to his son's stories, marveling at the sound of his laughter. But his gratitude extended beyond his son. To Naomi, the woman who had seen what his wealth and experts could not. Arthur poured his resources into a new mission, one born not of ambition, but of redemption. He founded the Brooks Foundation for Children's Hearing, named in honor of Naomi and her brother Marcus, whose memory had driven her courage. The foundation aimed to provide free hearing screenings and treatments to underprivileged children, ensuring no child would suffer in silence as Marcus had. Arthur diverted millions from his tech empire to fund clinics, train specialists, and develop affordable hearing aids, his boardroom precision now channeled into a cause greater than profit. On a crisp spring morning, the Winthrop Mansion opened its doors to journalists, families, and community leaders for the Foundation's inaugural event. The library, once a place of solitude, was transformed into a vibrant hall, adorned with Jake's paintings and paper stars hanging from the ceiling. A podium stood at the center, surrounded by rows of chairs filled with guests. Naomi stood near the back, her daughter clutching her hand, her simple dress a quiet contrast to the glittering crowd. She felt out of place, her heart racing, but Jake's grin from across the room steadied her. Arthur took the podium, his presence commanding yet softened, his eyes carrying a warmth that hadn't existed before. Cameras flashed as he leaned into the microphone. "A year ago, my son lived in silence," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I spent millions chasing answers, but it was a woman I once called a maid who did what no doctor could." She listened. He paused, his gaze finding Naomi. "Naomi Brooks gave me back my son, and today, we honor her by ensuring no child goes unheard." The hall erupted in applause, the sound swelling like a wave. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, her chest tight with pride and disbelief. She'd never sought recognition, only Jake's healing, yet here she was, the heart of a movement. Her daughter squeezed her hand, whispering, "That's you, Mama." Naomi smiled, brushing a tear away, as Jake bounded toward her, his voice ringing out. "Miss Naomi, you hear that? They're clapping for you." She laughed, kneeling to hug him, her heart full. The crowd's applause grew louder, a chorus of gratitude that echoed beyond the mansion's walls. Arthur stepped down from the podium and approached Naomi, his expression unguarded. "Thank you," he said quietly, his words meant only for her. "Not just for Jake, but for showing me what matters." Naomi nodded, her voice soft but firm. This is for Marcus, too. For all the kids like him. Arthur's eyes glistened, and for a moment, they stood as equals, bound by a shared purpose. The Foundation's work began that day, with mobile clinics already scheduled to visit underserved neighborhoods. Families who had never dreamed of affording treatment lined up, their hope a testament to Naomi's courage. Jake, standing beside her, took her hand and pointed to his latest painting, a bright star shining over a city. "That's you," he said, his voice clear and proud. The boy who once lived in silence had become the voice of thousands. 1 year later, the Winthrop mansion glowed under the golden light of a late autumn afternoon, its marble halls alive with chatter and warmth. The Brooks Foundation for Children's Hearing marked its first anniversary, and the library was filled with families, doctors, and reporters, all gathered to celebrate a year of miracles. Paper stars hung from the ceiling, Jake's vibrant paintings lined the walls, and the air hummed with hope. The Foundation had already provided free hearing screenings to hundreds of children, its mobile clinics reaching neighborhoods where silence had once been a sentence, not a choice. Naomi stood near the front, her daughter at her side, her simple blue dress a quiet contrast to the polished crowd. She fidgeted with her hands, still unaccustomed to the spotlight, but Jake's bright grin from across the room anchored her. He was 11 now, his voice clear and confident, his sketches replaced by bold canvases of stars and cities. He bounded toward the podium, clutching a microphone, his eyes sparkling with excitement. The crowd hushed as Jake took a deep breath, his voice steady but shy. "This is my friend, Miss Naomi," he said, gesturing to her. "She helped me hear the world." His words, simple and true, carried the weight of a miracle. The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling like a tide. Naomi's cheeks warmed, her eyes glistening as she signed, "Proud of you, little star." Jake beamed, his laughter ringing out, a sound that once felt impossible. Arthur stood beside Naomi, his presence quieter now, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice low, meant only for her. "You didn't just give him hearing," he said, his eyes soft with gratitude. "You gave me my son." Naomi smiled, her tears catching the light. "Sometimes, Mr. Winthrop, you don't need to buy miracles. You just have to listen." Her words echoed the promise she'd made to her brother Marcus, to every child like him, and to Jake, a promise to never turn away. The audience rose to their feet, their applause a chorus of shared hope. Jake laughed again, louder this time, and ran to Naomi, wrapping his arms around her. She hugged him back, her heart full, the memory of that stormy night now a distant but sacred scar. The reporters' cameras flashed, capturing the moment. A billionaire, a boy, and a woman who had once been invisible, standing together as equals. Arthur stepped to the microphone, his voice steady but warm. "The Brooks Foundation is more than a charity," he said. "It's a reminder that the answers we seek often come from those we overlook. Naomi Brooks taught me that, and she taught my son to hear." He glanced at her, his eyes carrying a depth that words couldn't hold. The crowd clapped again, their cheers carrying out into the world, where clinics bearing Naomi's name were already changing lives. Naomi's daughter tugged at her hand, whispering, "You're a hero, Mama." Naomi shook her head, signing to Jake instead, "You're the hero." He giggled, mimicking her signs, and the room filled with laughter, a melody that wove through the once silent halls. As the event ended, families approached Naomi, sharing stories of children who could now hear their parents' voices, thanks to the foundation. A mother from a nearby clinic hugged her, tears in her eyes, and said, "You gave my girl a future." Naomi's chest tightened, not with pride, but with the quiet peace of knowing Marcus's memory lived on in every child they helped. Outside, the autumn leaves fell, catching the light like the paper stars Jake loved. The mansion, once a grave of echoes, was now a beacon of hope, its walls resonating with voices, laughter, and love. Naomi stood with Jake, watching the sunset, her heart steady. She had come to the mansion as a maid, desperate and unseen, but had left it as a catalyst for change, her courage rippling far beyond its glass walls, that in a world ruled by noise. One woman's silence brought the greatest sound of all: love. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and what lesson did you learn from Naomi's story today? Your comment might inspire someone else to listen with their heart, too.